Good day, everyone. So, we are now on Chapter 7 Urbanization and Rural Urban Migration Theory and Policy. So, together with Mr. Michael James V. Salvoro, I, Eliza J. Romano, are tasked to report this chapter. So, first, let us know the learning objectives or learning outcomes for this chapter. First is we focus on one of the most complex and nuanced dilemmas of the development process. Second is we examine the potential role of cities, both the modern and the urban informal sector. Third, we evaluate various policy options that governments in developing countries may wish to pursue. Fourth, examine how the great potential dynamism and productivity of developing cities can be better harnessed for rapid and more inclusive economic development. So I am going to start the presentation on 7.1, the urbanization, trends, and living conditions. So according to the internet, what is rural urban migration? So the internet definition says that it is both a socio-economic phenomenon and a spatial process involving the movement of people from rural areas. So rural areas kanang sa bukid into cities, either permanently or semi-permanently. So at present hours, it occurs mainly in developing countries as they undergo rapid urbanization. So it is prevalent also sa Pilipinas nga kaning rural to urban migration. So what is urbanization? So urbanization refers to the population shift from rural to urban areas. The corresponding decrease in the proportion of people living in rural areas and the ways in which societies adapt to this change. So example of urbanization is the Asia Pacific region. It is a great example of urbanization as it contains over half of the world's population of city dwellers. So kanang mo adto sa city jud, ang main reason jud nila is mangitag kwarta because lisod man maka-income pag naarap magpundura ka permi sa bukid. While the world as a whole became majority urban in 2009, even the developing world is expected to become majority urban before 2020, although the United Nations projects that the least developed countries will not reach this milestone until after 2050. So in 2012, the United Nations or UN projected that the urban population of Africa will grow from 414 million in 2012 to over 1.2 billion by 2050, and the urban population of Asia will grow from 1.9 billion to 3.3 billion. Thus, taken together, the United Nations projects that Asia and Africa will account for some 86% of the global urban population increase in this period. So there will be so much rural to urban migration in Asia that its rural population will actually decline in this figure. So as we see in figure 7.1. So we note that urbanization rates increase whenever urban population growth exceeds rural population growth. So the positive association between urbanization and per capita income is one of the most obvious and striking stylized facts of the development process. So when we say kanang ginote diha nga urbanization rates increase whenever urban population growth exceeds rural population growth, it generally means nga the more developed the country measured by per capita income, the greater the share of population living in urban areas. So figure 7.2 shows the urbanization versus the lag of 2010 GNI per capita. The highest income countries such as Japan are also among the most urbanized, while the very poorest countries such as Burundi are among the least urbanized. So urbanization is proceeding rapidly. According to UN projections, there will be almost 5 billion urban dwellers by 2030, nearly 5/8 of projected world population for that year. The projected 2030 urban population of Africa of 748 million will be larger than the entire 685 million population of Europe. While individual countries became more urbanized as they developed, today's poorest countries are far more urbanized than today's developed countries, where when they were at a comparable level of development as measured by income per capita. So returning on 7.2, figure 7.2, the dashed blue linear fit line shows the relationship between income per capita and urbanization that prevailed in 1960. So a comparison of the two lines reveals that for any given income in 2010, a country that had identical income in 1960 was significantly less urbanized. So urbanization is happening everywhere in the world, although at differing rates. Figure 7.3 shows the urbanization over time and across income levels over the quarter century from 1970 to 1995. In recent decades, urbanization has continued in nearly all developing countries, even those that have experienced only minimal industrialization. So figure 7.3, each line segment represents the trajectory of one country starting from the solid dots, which represents the 1970 income and urbanization level for a given country, and ending at the end of the line segments marked by a diamond, which represents the corresponding 1995 income and urbanization level for the same country. So although World Bank caption to the figure stated that urbanization is closely associated with economic growth, figure 7.3 also be interpreted as showing that urbanization is occurring everywhere at high and low levels of income and whether growth is positive or negative. Even when the lines point to the left, indicating shrinking incomes per capita over the period, they still generally point upward, indicating that urbanization continued. So in short, urbanization is happening everywhere in the world, although at the differing rates. It becomes clear that urbanization is not driven solely by income. Some countries with approximately the same income levels are significantly more or less urbanized, partly due to differing domestic policies. So we need to consider urbanization carefully. So is it only correlated with economic development, or is causation also at work? So one of the most significant of all modern demographic phenomena is the rapid growth of cities in developing countries. In 1950, some 275 million people were living in cities in the developing world. 38% of the 724 million total urban population. By 2010, the world's urban population had surpassed 3.4 billion, with over three-quarters of all urban dwellers living in metropolitan areas of low and middle-income countries. While in significant number of cases, the speed at which the share of urban population has increased in developing countries in the late 20th and early 21st century is not much faster than in many of the developed countries when they were urbanizing in the late 19th century. Nonetheless, shares of urban population are being reached, particularly in Africa, at lower levels of per capita income than at a comparable stage in developed countries, as we see earlier at figure 7.2. Figure 7.4 provides a map locating megacities, the largest urban agglomerations in the world, containing a population of at least 10 million people. So we will later on we will define what agglomeration is and its type. So as the figure shows, in 1970, there were only two cities but by 1990, there were 10, and by 2011, there were 23 such metropolises. So, of these, 18 over 3 quarters were located in the developing world. By 2025, 30 of the 37 megacities, more than 80%, will be in developing countries. Figure 7.5 presents total urban population in millions by different cities for 1970, 1990, and 2011 with projections to 2025. In 2011, more people lived in megacities of over 10 million than in cities from 5 to 10 million people in size. In principle, a megacity could offer large agglomeration economies, although congestion costs may rise rapidly. Another potential downside is that megacities tend to be more capital intensive, which does not match with the comparative advantage of most developing countries. Megacities, particularly in low-income countries, may also have outsized social and health problems. The relative balance of these factors is likely to differ across countries depending on the forces that led these cities to reach their megascales. We are now on figure 7.6. 7.6 shows going forward, and almost of all the increments to the world's population will be accounted for by the growth of urban areas as migrants continue to stream into the cities from rural areas and as urbanization rates in the developing world continue to approach those of the developed world. Along with the rapid spread of urbanization and the urban bias in development strategies has come this prolific growth of huge slums and shanty towns. So, urban bias, it is the notion that most governments in developing countries favor the urban sector in their development policies, thereby creating a widening gap between the urban and rural economies. Figure 7.7, the annual growth of urban and slums populations from 1990 to 2001. So the annual growth of urban and slum populations in the 1990 to 2001 period drawn from the 2006 UN Millennium Development Goals. So we see here that sub-Saharan Africa, it is the world's most rapidly urbanizing region. In Western Asia, most of the urban growth is occurring in slums. The rapid expansion of urban areas in Southern and Eastern Asia is creating cities in unprecedented size and complexity and new challenges for providing a decent environment for the poor. Lastly, Northern Africa is the only developing region where the quality of urban life is improving. The importance of addressing this problem has been enshrined in the Millennium Development Goals later on Chapter 11, in which Target 11 of Goal 7 commits to improve the lives of at least 100 million slum dwellers by the year 2020. Yet, even though this number seems likely to be met, it represents only about 1/4 of all urban slum dwellers as of 2013. It is extremely difficult to provide reliable projections of slum populations further into the future because much depends on uncertain future policies and economic growth rates, as well as the extent of migration that occurs in response to growth and policy change. Although population growth and accelerated rural-urban migration are chiefly responsible for the explosion in urban shantytowns, part of the blame rests with governments. Their misguided urban planning policies and outmoded building codes often mean that a majority of new urban housing is illegal. So example of this, in Manila, Philippines, a large majority of the population has historically been too poor to be able to buy or rent an officially legal house. So a widely held belief in some developing countries is that governments have intentionally sought to make the lives of new migrants as measurable as possible, hoping this will be an effective deterrent to prospective migrants. But when people come to cities anyway, slums are inevitable result. According to book definition, rural-urban migration is the movement of people from rural villages, towns, and farms to urban centers or cities in search of jobs. A critical issue that needs to be addressed is to the extent to which national governments can formulate development policies that can have a definite impact on trends in and the character of urban growth. It is clear that the emphasis on industrial modernization, technological sophistication, and metropolitan growth created a substantial geographic imbalance in economic opportunities and contributed significantly to the accelerating influx of rural migrants into urban areas. Before examining the other problems and policy approaches in developing country cities more closely, let us first consider the potential advantages offered by cities. Urban areas have played a highly constructive role in the largely untapped potential to do the same for developing countries. A detailed look at the informal sector in developing cities will give an idea of its potential as an engine of growth. We also consider in more detail what has been different and what has been gone wrong with urban development and the excessively rapid pace of rural-urban migration in many developing countries. We conclude with a look at constructive policies to help cities foster successful urban development while at the same time giving more balanced treatment to development in rural areas. So, yes, it is true nga cities plays an important role pod kay what if walay city, so asa man mangitag trabaho ang mga taga bukid, unsaon man nila pag-produce og income, unsaon man nila pag survive in their day to day basis, og dili sila mo risk nga moadto sa city because cities offers jobs man pod, even kinagamay sa wage, maka-afford man jud, makapadala man sa pamilya nga to sa bukid. So being in a city has an advantage jud, dili ra jud siya mere nga daghan siyang disadvantages.